Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Associate Professor Craig Nitschke from the University of Melbourne, and I classify myself as a forest and landscape ecologist. I've been asked to give a talk on conservation planning in dynamic environments. I'm not going to be talking about sugar gliders or greater gliders. I'm going to be talking about Leadbetter's possum as a case study, but I want to highlight some of the work that we've been doing about how we can consider the impacts of climate and fire and management into conservation planning. So I think the outcomes of our work have easy implications and extensions to other flora and fauna around the state. When we think about dynamic environments, there's probably a few key elements that would drop into people's minds, climate being one of them. So the variability in climate, droughts and floods, climate change, the changes in fire regimes, the increase in fire, for example, in Australian landscapes over the last 20 years has been quite significant. And so that may play into people's minds around what a dynamic environment may be. When we think about some of that dynamic environments from our context, not only are we thinking about the year-to-year variation, but also the future. You know, how are landscapes changing? How are forests changing? How's habitat changing for a variety of different flora and fauna? Here's an example of some simulations of the potential change in the regeneration ability or the regeneration niche of alpine ash, Eucalyptus delicatensis. And these kind of tools allow us to explore how might the distribution of this species change over time. Now, if you're an animal reliant on alpine ash forest, this change in the amount of area that alpine ash occurs in or where it could occur could have implications for you. We've also been working on looking at how the impacts of recent fire, changes in recent fire regimes have impacting plant communities. So some of the work that a former student of mine, Tom Fairman's done, looking at mixed species forests and subalpine woodlands, have showed that increasing fire frequency can have significant effects on the structure and composition of the vegetation communities in these ecosystems. I'm just going to show the impact of 3 fires on subalpine woodland. In this case, what we found was that increasing amount of fire, so 3 fires within a 15-year period, led to up to 50% mortality, in some cases even higher than that, in the snow gums themselves, and pretty much the removal of the understory, conversion of the understory from a shrubby dominated understory to a grassy understory. So if you're a flora species associated with these shrubby communities, this is not a good outcome for you. And if you're a fauna species reliant on a shrubby understory, this change in the structure will have implications for your habitat availability. So effective conservation planning for species in these dynamic worlds requires obviously knowing what their habitat is, and for many species we simply don't know that enough, but that's a question for a different day. But for the species that we do know what their habitat requirements are, that's not a good enough place to stop to do our planning. We would argue that we need to understand how those habitat elements change in space and time, and this is really important. We can go to one spot on a landscape and monitor that and get a good understanding of how it changes at that one point. But how does it change at other places in the landscape? And how do those all interact? What drives that change? What are the threatening processes that underpin those dynamics? Is it climate? Is it fire? Is it human management, such as planned burning or timber harvesting? Is it all of the above? And understanding those interactions becomes really important for designing conservation strategies and conservation plans that can account for these dynamics. Many species aren't influenced just by one habitat element, and this is where it starts to get really complicated, because even with 2 habitat elements that may be changing at different spatial and temporal scales, it become quite difficult to design conservation networks that can account for both of these. So this is an example of a simple habitat dynamic for Leadbetter's possum. So there's 2 key elements in here: foraging habitat which is outlined by this red line here, and nesting habitat, which is outlined by these blue and black lines. They operate at different temporal scales. So following a fire, foraging habitat will increase and then decline within a 100-year period usually, whereas hollow-bearing trees, live ones, may take up to 200 years to form, whereas the dead hollow-bearing trees from that recent fire may be declining over that 50 to 100-year period. So we've got different dynamics happening with different habitat elements, and this can be all in one stand. That kind of dynamic provides some really big limitations for a lot of the current methods that are used for conservation planning. We typically like to use statistical models, and these typically aren't suited for forecasting into the future because they don't include those habitat dynamics. They're what we consider correlative, not causal. And that means that changing some of the underlying processes that climate change may bring or a changing fire regime may not yield the same results. Or these models simply don't include the dynamics of the habitat. They include what has been observed and is then used to parameterize the model. So we need to be able to overcome these limitations. And that requires being able to include what is in our forest, what's the composition, what's the structure, and how they change. The inclusion of stochastic processes such as disturbances, wildfire, an obvious one here for Australia, and systematic change. For example, broad-scale climate change, gradual change in our global climate system and what that may mean. We also need to be able to consider stochasticity. So I also want to highlight a little bit between determinism and stochasticity. So a deterministic model is what it means is every time you run the model, you get the same output. Whereas a stochastic model, when you run a model, you get different outputs. Now, there's varying degrees of how models that are used for understanding the impacts of environmental change on species incorporate stochasticity. Some use stochasticity in demographic rates, and so that you get an error bar and uncertainties. Other ones use deterministic events, such as these papers here on Ledbetter's possum, where they had stochastic variation in the life history parameters, but deterministic impacts of fire. Now, the deterministic impacts of fire is a bit of a problem because fires aren't deterministic, and we can all know that. They're quite stochastic, which meaning from any given year to any given year, there's a different probability of a fire occurring or not. And this can have huge implications at a landscape scale about habitat dynamics and turnover. The other thing that's really important when we think about dynamic landscapes is how we view the landscape itself. Now, there are two ways that we can do this. Well, there's many ways, to be honest, but two kind of primary ways. One is this historical way of thinking about the landscape as a binary. So habitat areas, so these could be our reserves. We think of them as isolated, like islands in a matrix, a hostile matrix. And what this means is that we can simulate the demography, so the vital rates of populations within these habitats, and we can subject them to these disturbances. But this is the only habitat that they're able to access in that landscape. And this has implications for how the dynamics and the viability of these reserves would be assessed. So in this case, we could be left over time with one viable reserve, or many of the reserves will have high extinction probabilities. And some reserves may pop up and may not be able to be recolonized because they're too far away from a reserve that has the animals in it. And it is a very common approach to how people view landscapes. But this approach has evolved out of thinking of landscapes that are quite binary, as I mentioned before. There's a patch of forest here and everything else, and habitat, and everything else is not habitat and does not become habitat. But in reality, a lot of our forest landscapes, or most of the landscapes I work in, are what we consider gradient landscapes or mosaics. There's a shifting spatial and temporal pattern of vegetation composition and structure over time in response to wildfires or human-based disturbances. Now, this shifting template causes habitat to form and for habitat to be lost in any given part of the landscape. However, we need to view this as a landscape where habitat forms and falls apart in different parts, and what implications does it have? So a gradient landscape approach essentially will allow habitat to form in between reserve systems which animals can move into, and habitat can be lost and reformed, but the animals are able to move around these landscapes and recover and recolonize. So using different parts of the landscape as habitat. And I'll come back to this idea at the end of my talk and why this might be important for dynamic environments and conservation. I wanted to bring you back to that simple pathway as well that I mentioned earlier in my talk. So this is that same type of leadbetter's possum habitat and potential pathways that habitats could take in a landscape given the chance of fire. Now again, we could look at these at any one point in time. But then if we put them all into a spatial grid, these pathways could be occurring in different parts of the landscape, creating this mosaic of habitat. And in any one of these places on the landscape could be in any one of these different stages of these pathways. And so it becomes quite complex. And that means, though, that the animals will be responding to fluctuations in habitat differently in these different locations. And so we need to be able to consider them all together. And that brings me to the paper that we published this year on looking at how do we consider these dynamic environments in our conservation planning. So this study took place in the Central Highlands region of Victoria in this little black butterfly-looking shape here. This is around a 280,000 hectare landscape. Right? We considered 4 scenarios of climate change and management, and these were developed with the state government, with the Department of Environment, Land, Water, and Planning, to reflect their current management practices and the current processes that are impacting this landscape. So bushfires, plant burning, timber harvesting, climate change. And we looked at how the vegetation changed in response to these landscape processes, and then how that influenced the habitat suitability of leadbetter's possum. We use a model called LANDIS2, and it stands for Landscape Disturbance and Succession. Now this model was developed in the 1980s and has continuously been developed since then and been applied to forests all over the world, from South America, North America, Europe, Asia, and now Australia with our work. The model is a spatial model. It uses raster grids. For people who are familiar with what a raster is, it's a spatial map where it has cells, little square cells, and in each cell there's information on the composition and age class of the forest, so what species are there and how old they are. The model allows for fire and harvesting, wind, insects, diseases to be applied to affect forests, and these are done stochastically in a lot of cases, especially with fire and wind and insects. There's dispersal, so species have to be able to move. There's recruitment, so regeneration, which is a function of climate, dispersal itself. That climate can be influenced by climate change. We've got traits in there, such as is a species an obligate seeder? Is it a resprouter? Is there enough light for the species to recruit when they come to a site? And so forth. And these iterate through on a single 1 year time step, and we do this at a 1 hectare resolution. So there's a lot of information here. And we can use these maps, this model, to, for example, look at a single species. This is a projection of what Eucalyptus regnans distribution could look like at over 200 years under a really high extreme climate scenario. This is just one particular outcome, and even the age class structure of what that forest could be. We use published models. This is models that we use in our paper. They're based a lot on David Lindemeyer and Hugh Possingham's work from the 1990s with a few modifications. For example, areas that had timber harvesting had dead hollow-bearing trees removed from them so as they didn't contribute to habitat in the stag collapse form. And we also modified the part of the model which assumed acacias live forever in one stand, and actually, but with the quantitative information we have on how old they live. And instead of having them, facing this dynamic, we essentially made some assumptions based on observations today of, well, if you've got hollow-bearing trees and foraging habitat, they don't have to be in the same cell together. they can actually co-occur or be in juxtaposition to each other, and that's forming habitat. So this is a good example where a Ledbetter's possum colony has been detected in a regrowth area, and so they're foraging in this half, but they're nesting in an old forest in this half. So our approach allows that dynamic to be considered. And we tested the model, and it does really well. Substantial agreement between observed sites and modeled sites that we said models should have possums in them. And we can put all this complexity together into a framework of how do we account for changes in climate. So this is some modeling on how climate affects the recruitment and growth of the forest, the Landis model, which I've gone through, and then we've got this program down here called Circuscape, which essentially organizes habitat suitability outcomes into cores of habitat or habitat patches. And what we're really interested through all of this stuff is this idea of identifying stable areas of habitat. So given all of this dynamics of climate, all the dynamics of disturbance from humans or from wildfire, are there areas in the landscape that remain stable in time? And that these areas potentially could be key conservation areas. So considering all the dynamics going on, if we identify areas that constantly provide habitat under this dynamic forcing, then perhaps these are really important for thinking about in the future, or the now and the future. So what are the results of our study? Well, here's 6 metrics. Now I mentioned we had 4 management scenarios. I won't get into it too much in the sense that there was very little impact of management on this. In part, there was more influence of climate change, which we would expect, than management. But what we found was really interesting. You know, we've got this temporal signature in this landscape of an increasing early number of patches over time. As the more patches we get, the smaller they get, unfortunately, and that's not a great thing. And their suitability declines. So in the future, suggesting that even though we might have more patches of habitat out there, they might be less suitable and they might be smaller in size. Now, they're still fairly good size at 50 hectares on average, which is, you know, well above the size of some of the home ranges of many. That would be enough for, you know, 10 to 15 colonies of possums, but still a bigger patch is a better patch. The patches were also more aggregated with each other, which means they're becoming more clustered in certain parts of the landscape. So potentially becoming spatially aggregated, which could have implications for the ability of species to move between aggregates if they're too far apart, between colonies, or even moving between aggregates that are too far apart. The number of nesting resources was modeled to increase in the landscape, which is a good thing, but only to about 25% of the landscape. So, you know, even though we had an increase in nesting, it wasn't across a massive amount of the landscape. And our foraging resources were very fluctuating. But what we can pull between this out is the number of patches is quite tied to the number of nesting resources. So the more nesting resources you had, the more patches you had, and your habitat suitability was tied to your foraging. So they work together, whereas patch size and spatial pattern were an interaction really between these 2 metrics. So both foraging and nesting habitat was important. And so this is the influence of those elements on Ledbetter's possum habitat. And what we can see again is that nesting and foraging, yes, they're important on all these metrics, but look at wildfire. That's the most influential landscape process on the habitat. Yes, timber harvesting and plant burning had influences that were smaller, but the big one was wildfire. Now, climate change is interesting. You think, how is very small influence? That's because the direct effect of climate change in these simulations wasn't that great, but climate change had an indirect effect because of its interactions with wildfire. So I'm not going to show those results, but that's where climate change really came through. Not the direct effect, but the indirect effect through how it affected wildfire. And there were some interactions in here, and these are the 2 big ones. The amount of area burned and the nesting resources in terms of number of patches and patch size. So as the amount of area burns on this landscape, we get a lot more patches, particularly in this intermediate zone up here. That's the greatest number of patches. Where you've got less area burned, communal area burned, we have bigger patch sizes. So this is telling us that wildfire is driving both the number of patches and their size. That's that understanding that I was mentioning at the beginning is, what are the processes driving the habitat? So in this landscape, wildfire is the big one. It's the big driver, big threatening process at the landscape scale. And that's really important that keep in mind that this is in the context of a landscape scale. It's not a small 20 or 100 hectare area of forest that's being disturbed. It's at a 280,000 hectare level. So that's a really important caveat, and hopefully that you can just keep in mind as I talk through those resources. We're talking about landscape scale impacts. And at the landscape scale, because our model is stochastic and we run many simulations, we get different outcomes. And we can use those outcomes to understand how variable, how transient, or how stable is habitat. And here's just a simple example of how we did that. And so we got 2 time periods, and you can see in time 50, we've got less habitat, actually got more habitat in the end, but that's just a, evolution of the forest. We're getting a little bit more habitat, but we're getting a lot of red versus over here. And so what we have here are these flecks of red and green. The green are stable areas. And so in this little block, this is the Ado forest block, we can see after 50 years, these green areas, these are cores, habitat cores, which we model to be fairly stable in that time period. We jump ahead to 250 years later, we see that stability is gone. And so this is a lot of variation here. There's a lot of warm colors, and these are indicative of transient habitat. So this bit of the landscape had a lot of stability for a 50-year period, and as we go out longer, we get an indication that's actually more likely to be transient habitat. And that transience has been driven by wildfire. Aspatially, we can look at the elevation gradient, the effects of how this habitat elements are distributed. So the black areas are the stable habitat areas that we've identified, and these gray areas are the transient ones. And you see over time, we get a lot more transient habitat developing. And again, it's just, the more time you simulate the dynamics of habitat, the more replicates you do, there's different parts of the landscape that could form habitat. So these aren't the absolute numbers. These is just in a sense an artifact of the time and space and the chances of certain parts of the landscape having habitat. But it does tell you that there are parts of the landscape that form habitat over time that we might not consider habitat today. A couple of the clear findings in this is noticing this peak, and down here this increase in stable habitat at higher elevations, and this big decline in the end of transient habitat at lower elevations. So even though we're calling this transient habitat, this loss is of concern because these transient habitats could provide key habitat elements within that gradient of the landscape that I mentioned earlier. So these gray areas are really important and indicative that we might be losing these under climate change. Putting that all together in a spatial context, we can look at these 2 climate change scenarios and these with or without management. Now, we don't see much difference with and without management, but you can see the difference between the climate change scenarios. There's a lot more at this higher elevation through here. The darker colors indicate areas of greater stability. And these are the ones that we think about refugia, for example, areas that provide habitat within disturbance. At a landscape level, these darker areas provide greater stability under a dynamic world. So of future fires, future climate, the impacts of human management on these landscapes through timber harvesting or plant burning, whatever it may be, these darker areas of increasing provide that greater stability. In a more colorful way, we can break this down to areas where currently there's habitat that's lost and where it maintains and where we might gain it. And we see this impact of elevation in here as well. But again, there's parts of the landscape that we might gain habitat even at lower elevations. And so it's dynamic. The habitat fluxes and wanes and waxes over time and space. Breaking this down to how the landscape is classified into conservation tenures, at the general landscape level, what we found is that 70%, over 70% of the habitat is transient, so less than 50 years. But that's still important. There's still, of the habitat that's in there, most of it's transient, but they still provide key habitat over time. And then we've got this group of around 20 and upwards of 40% in some of the conservation areas that provide habitat, should or may provide habitat for between 50 and 100 years. And a lot less, though, less than 10% that we might expect to provide habitat for greater than 100 years. So this is telling us that the habitat is very dynamic, and across all these conservation elements, we would expect turnover to happen in time and space. So the key findings for this is that wildfire is the most influential driver, and that really affected the abundance and distribution of the foraging and nesting resources at the landscape level. We did identify 27,000 to 32,000 hectares, depending on which scenario and replicates you looked at, of forest outside of that current network. And this is, I think, the probably really key one for us, that this 27 to 32,000 hectares of habitat areas could provide this stable habitat under a dynamic future. And this represents 9.5 to 11% of the landscape area assessed. So it's a good chunk of it, but it's probably the areas that we would consider should be the backbone of our conservation network. If these areas can provide core habitat for greater than 50, greater than 100 years, then those transient areas of habitat that wax in and wax out, or fluctuate in and out over time as disturbances impact the landscape, these core areas can provide that movement pattern I mentioned in that diagram of gradient landscapes. The species can move out into these transient areas and use them as long as they're there, and then move back and forth. And it would also provide movement corridors and connectivity through these landscapes. Our results highlight that we need to think about coordinated conservation planning. So we do need to be thinking about how do we connect these core stable areas, and how do we maintain and manage them to help balance that fluctuation of that more transient habitat. Our results also indicated that the remaining parts of the landscape where this transient habitat occurs, we do have to be thinking about wildfire and forest management together. We did find a cumulative effect, in particular of wildfire and timber harvesting. And after a certain amount of timber harvesting, you started to have some negative effects on the habitat at a landscape scale, again, at a landscape scale. Now, I know this is a greater glider symposium, and so I thought we could briefly talk about greater gliders. We have done this modeling for greater gliders, and actually one of the impetus for having Ben Wagner study greater gliders was because of some of the results we got. We can simulate the habitat of greater gliders in these models with the impacts of wildfire and climate and on the structure and composition of the forest. And when we do this, we can model what we see here, potential increases in greater glider habitat, some of this in this landscape anyway. But this didn't really fit with what is being observed. And what we know now from Ben's work, and I'm not sure if you've listened to Ben's talk before mine or if you will listen to Ben's talk after mine, but what we do know is that we can't just consider forest structure and composition on its own when we look at greater gliders. And so this modeling can provide a foundation for understanding the effects, the direct effects of environmental change on the structure and composition of its habitat, but it may not address some of the other constraints like the climatic effects on its physiology. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. And I look forward to Any questions you may have during the symposium?